The man in the cave had been dead for over 5,000 years. Yet when archaeologists opened his stomach, they discovered something shocking. Inside were traces of foods no supermarket on Earth sells anymore. Plants that once fed entire tribes, grains that survived ice ages, seeds that could grow in places modern crops would instantly die. And here's the unsettling part. Many of those foods didn't disappear naturally. They were pushed out, replaced, forgotten. For most of human history, survival depended on knowing hundreds of wild plants, roots, and grains. Entire cultures built their diets around foods that could grow in brutal climates, survive drought, or feed people through harsh winters. Knowledge of these foods was passed down for thousands of years. Then, in less than a century, most of that knowledge vanished. Today, over 75% of the world's food comes from just 12 plant species: wheat, rice, corn, soybeans, a handful of others. The rest of humanity's ancient food library, thousands of plants once used for survival, has been erased from everyday life. Not because they stopped growing, but because modern systems stopped using them. Take einkorn wheat, one of the oldest grains humanity ever cultivated. Archaeologists have traced it back more than 10,000 years to the Fertile Crescent. It fed early farmers long before modern wheat even existed. Unlike modern wheat, einkorn grows in rocky soil where nothing else survives. It tolerates cold mountain climates. It resists many pests naturally, and its gluten structure is completely different from the wheat used in modern bread. But there's one major problem. Einkorn produces smaller harvests. Modern industrial farming is built on one rule: maximize yield per acre. Crops must grow uniformly. Machines must harvest them quickly. Every plant must mature at the same time. Einkorn doesn't cooperate with that system. So it was quietly replaced by modern hybrid wheat: higher yields, easier harvesting, bigger profits. Today, most people have never even heard of the grain that fed some of the first farming civilizations. Then there's teff, a tiny grain from Ethiopia that sustained entire societies for thousands of years. Teff seeds are almost unbelievably small. One handful contains thousands of grains. But that tiny size hides something remarkable. Teff grows in drought conditions that would destroy most commercial crops. It matures quickly, it thrives in poor soil, and nutritionally it's packed with iron, calcium, and protein. For centuries, it formed the backbone of Ethiopian food culture. But when global agriculture shifted toward large-scale export crops like wheat and corn, grains like teff were pushed to the margins. Not because they were weak, but because they didn't fit industrial farming models. You can't easily mass harvest something the size of a grain of sand. And then there's a plant most people would walk past without noticing: amaranth. Thousands of years ago, amaranth was one of the most important crops in the Americas. The Aztecs grew it alongside corn and beans as one of their staple foods. It grows incredibly fast. It survives drought. Its leaves are edible. Its seeds are rich in protein and essential amino acids rarely found in plants. In other words, it's a survival crop. But after the Spanish conquest of the Americas, colonial authorities banned its cultivation in many regions because it was associated with indigenous religious ceremonies. Farmers who grew it risked punishment. Over time, fields that once produced amaranth were replaced by European crops like wheat and barley. One of the most resilient food plants on Earth nearly disappeared, not because it failed, but because history pushed it aside. And those are just three. Hidden across the world are dozens of plants that once fed entire populations, crops that thrived without fertilizers, chemicals, or modern farming systems. Plants that could grow in deserts, mountains, flooded plains, or frozen ground. Most people today have never heard their names. But the story of how they disappeared gets even stranger, because some of the most powerful survival foods humanity ever relied on didn't just fade away.
they were deliberately replaced. And the next one on this list might be the most surprising of all. For thousands of years, one plant quietly grew in places where almost nothing else could survive. Rocky hillsides, thin mountain soil, wind-swept plains where farming should have been impossible. That plant was millet. Long before wheat and rice dominated global agriculture, millet fed some of the largest early civilizations on Earth. Archaeologists have found evidence of millet farming in China dating back more than 7,000 years. It sustained populations across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. Millet had something modern crops often lack: resilience. It grows with very little water. It matures quickly. It tolerates poor soil and extreme temperatures. In regions where drought could wipe out wheat fields, millet kept producing food. For centuries, it was considered one of humanity's most reliable survival grains. Then the world changed. During the 20th century, governments began heavily promoting high-yield crops like wheat and rice. Subsidies, agricultural research, and global trade systems all focused on a narrow group of grains that could produce the largest harvests under industrial farming. Millet didn't disappear, but it was pushed aside. Fields that once grew millet were converted to crops better suited for mechanized farming and global export markets. One of humanity's oldest survival foods slowly faded from everyday diets. Then there's a plant that might surprise you even more: breadfruit. In the tropical islands of the Pacific, breadfruit trees once formed the backbone of entire food systems. A single mature tree could produce hundreds of fruits every year. The fruit is rich in carbohydrates, fiber, and vitamins. When cooked, its texture resembles fresh bread, hence the name. But the most remarkable part isn't the fruit, it's the tree. Breadfruit trees can produce food for 50 years or more with almost no maintenance. They grow naturally in tropical climates without fertilizers, pesticides, or irrigation. Plant one tree and it feeds families for generations. In the late 1700s, the British Empire recognized its potential. In fact, one of the most famous maritime stories in history, the Mutiny on the Bounty, began as a mission to transport breadfruit trees across the world as a cheap food source for colonial plantations. The plan failed after the mutiny, but breadfruit remained one of the most efficient food trees humanity ever cultivated. Yet outside tropical regions, most people today have never tasted it. Because modern food systems favor crops that move easily through global supply chains, grains that can be stored for years, shipped across continents, and processed in factories. A fresh tropical fruit from a tree doesn't fit that model. And then there's a plant most people would walk past without noticing: Jerusalem artichoke, also called the sunchoke. Despite the name, it's neither from Jerusalem nor an artichoke. It's actually a species of sunflower that produces edible underground tubers. Those tubers are incredibly hardy. They survive freezing temperatures underground. They grow in poor soil. They spread easily and return every year without replanting. During times of famine and war in Europe, Jerusalem artichokes often became emergency food crops because they could grow where other crops failed. But they have one trait modern agriculture dislikes: they grow unpredictably. Industrial farming relies on crops that behave uniformly, plants that mature at the same time, grow to the same height, and produce predictable yields for machinery. Jerusalem artichokes spread naturally. They grow in irregular clusters. They don't follow strict agricultural schedules. So while they still exist, they were gradually pushed out of large-scale farming, replaced by crops easier to control. When you step back and look at the pattern, something strange appears. Humanity once relied on hundreds of food plants perfectly adapted to different climates and landscapes. Some thrived in deserts, some in flooded fields, some in mountains, some underground through the winter. But modern food systems narrowed that diversity dramatically. Today, the global diet is built on a tiny number of crops optimized for large-scale production, shipping, and processing. The rest of humanity's ancient food library, thousands of plants once used for survival, has been erased from everyday life. Not because they stopped growing, but because modern systems stopped using them. But the story of how they disappeared gets even stranger, because some of the most powerful survival foods humanity ever relied on didn't just fade away, they were deliberately replaced. And the next one on this list might be the most surprising of all. For thousands of years, one plant quietly grew in places where almost nothing else could survive. Rocky hillsides, thin mountain soil, wind-swept plains where farming should have been impossible. That plant was millet. Long before wheat and rice dominated global agriculture, millet fed some of the largest early civilizations on Earth. Archaeologists have found evidence